to this session, which is focused on the Civic Strength Index. And really looking forward to hearing from Leyden and Hannah from the GLA about kind of the work and the journey and kind of what the Civic Strength Index is. And I believe there'll be an exercise as well where you can kind of get into the index, and then there'll be breakouts to share kind of what work you're doing in this space, and particularly kind of what evidence and data you're kind of collecting or kind of looking at around civic strength. You might call it, you might call it something else. You might call it civic strength. So that's definitely a way for us to be able to, share knowledge across kind of London, local government, and other organisations working in this space. If you could kind of mute yourselves so that we can reduce the background noise, that would be great. But I'll hand over to Leyden and Hannah to tell us all about Civic Strength and the work they've been doing. So over to you both.
Thank you, Noel. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. It's great to see so many people interested in hearing more about our work around developing the first iteration of the Civic Strength Index. Just to introduce ourselves, so I'm Hannah. I'm the Principal Civil Society Officer in the Community Engagement Team at the Greater London Authority, and London is one of my colleagues who also works in the Community Engagement Team as our Research and Information Officer. So the Civic Strength Index was something that we commissioned last year. We really wanted, we were really aware of the fact. So not only, the pandemic demonstrated how much work civil society and communities do to kind of strengthen and support Londoners, but we're really aware that actually it's really difficult to quantify and measure that and demonstrate the kind of true value of what civil society and what communities are contributing to kind of day-to-day life and to ensuring people have access to support and services that they need. So we're really aware that because of that, it means they're not often effectively understood, and what they actually contribute is not often effectively understood. So what our principal aims for the work were, as you can see on this slide, was to develop firstly a shared definition. What do we mean by civic strength? Then to really unpick and understand what the key factors are that contribute to civic strength, and you'll hear us referring to them as domains. And we really wanted to develop those with Londoners, because we wanted to ensure that we weren't just defining civic strength based on what we could already measure. We wanted civic strength to be defined by actually what Londoners believe it to be. And then the third aim of this was then to start trying to measure these domains. So we commissioned the Young Foundation to do this work for us. And as a whole, it sits within the Building Strong Communities mission, which is part of the London Recovery Board's work to support London to thrive again after the impact of the pandemic. And the Building Strong Communities mission, as it says on the tin, is around how do we best support London's communities to build back stronger. And the Civic Strength Index sort of underpins that mission. So this is our kind of baselining. What does civic strength look like now, and how can we work to build out that strength across the capital? So next slide. So as I mentioned, we commissioned the Young Foundation to lead this work for us in March last year, and they undertook a lot of engagement. They undertook stakeholder workshops, community engagement workshops. We had a steering group of about 25 experts from boroughs, data experts, civil society representation, etc., to really start to unpick what we mean when we're talking about civic strength. We also did a lot of engagement on our Talk London platform, which allowed us to really start identifying what are the key factors, what are the key themes that contribute to civic strength. And what you'll see when London sort of talks you through the framework which they developed, a lot of these things are kind of what is often quite intangible, like the way that actually communities and a place makes you feel, the sense of belonging, a sense of kind of identity. And that obviously is great because it's given us a really robust definition of what civic strength is. But then, as we will get onto, there are some really key challenges there, and obvious challenges that it's then really hard to measure these things. So as it shows on the slide, the Young Foundation, through all that engagement, came up with the definition that civic strength is community supported by robust public and social infrastructure to build strong relationships and to feel able to meaningfully engage in the issues that matter to them. And this definition has then really helped shape the framework of the index, which is underpinned by 3 key themes, which are all referenced in that definition. So public and social infrastructure, relationships and social capital, and democratic engagement and being able to participate. The Young Foundation were able to kind of really draw out what Londoners had talked about to create this framework, which Ludden will go into more detail on soon. And what they then began to work on was actually, okay, so we've got these 3 themes, we've got the key kind of domains which sit under these themes, and now we need to start trying to work out how we measure them, what data exists that can be used as sort of proxy measures for some of these indicators, and where are the gaps. And we'll come to that a bit later, but that's kind of the framing for what the index was when we published it. We wanted to publish it as kind of a first iteration. We're really aware that there are big gaps in it, but actually we wanted to share this framework and share the kind of definition so we can then start having conversations with people like you to think through how we kind of actually make it a much more robust evidence base, which can then be used, you know, in decision making and understanding kind of the spread and the intersections of civic strength across different boroughs, across even to ward level, which we do have some data that is at ward level. So yeah, we really want this to be a kind of starting point, like opening up a conversation. How do we begin to measure civic strength more robustly? Is this a good framework? What's missing? How can we work together to think through how we fill those gaps? So I'll just hand over to Ludden now, who will kind of talk you through more of the framework that I've been referring to give you a bit more of that context.
Thanks, Hannah, and thanks for having us. So as Hannah said, the civic strength, this civic strength index is both a definition and a framework. And just to say, on the slide you can see here, the definition draws out the 3 themes of civic strength, but you can see on the slide it's the combination of all those themes as a measure and spread across London with the sort of measuring of strong to weak, and you can see that spread there. So yeah, the index is also sort of an interactive tool which you can explore, which we'll get into later. But in terms of the framework, as the definition sort of draws out, the framework is made of 3 themes of sort of civic strength, and that is relationships and social capital, democratic engagement, and public and social infrastructure. And underneath these 3 themes, there are sort of 12 key domains that sit underneath them that are that were sort of came up with via all that engagement and research and insight. And sitting underneath them are a number of indicators with which we use to measure these themes. And as Hannah said, sort of each of these themes serves a key purpose in sort of creating a real image of what civic strength is, and not only in terms of how they interact with each other, but how they sort of stand alone by themselves. And so, you know, relationships and social capital sort of encapsulates a lot of what, you know, communities often tell us is incredibly important but difficult to measure. That sense of feeling, what makes a community strong, all those ideas of belongings and ties, and sort of being able to take action and sort of lead a life you want to lead. The second theme of democratic engagement sort of builds on that feeling, but what are the sort of ideas that allow those feelings to be taken to action that can be meaningfully received by sort of local government, services, or sort of fellow citizens. And then in terms of the third theme of public and social infrastructure, it sort of captures all the things that you can sort of see. So all those services, spaces, and support that ensure sort of all else is possible, things like green spaces, funding opportunities, etc. And in terms, by framing the index in these sort of 3 thematic areas, like I said, the importance of each of them is really highlighted, but it's essential to understand them all working together when we sort of think about civic strength as a whole. And what you'll see in the next couple of slides is understanding how we've been able to best measure them, and the sort of data that we've been able to sort of find and not find for these themes. So I'm just going to take you through sort of like a deep dive into each of the 3 themes. So the first is relationships and social capital, and underneath this particular theme sits 5 domains and a number of indicators underneath those domains that we in the Young Foundation found to measure these around relationships and social capital. So you can see they are opportunities for community life, social support, relationships, trust and social cohesion, and community action. And this is all sort of what's come out of all of the work in terms of engagement of what people feel contributes to this particular theme. And in terms of the shading on the boxes, in blue, highlighted in blue, is what we could find really robust data that was sort of data that was captured consistently and readily available across all of London. And then the boxes that are slightly more grayed out are where this information was either sort of not as readily available or was not as consistently collected across London. And in terms of sort of next steps, which Hannah will touch on later, this is really what the focus of our work in the next phase is in terms of building out some of the gaps we sort of found. But you can see that in terms of social support, we were able to sort of find consistent and robust data across London on number of former volunteers, registered charities, number of food banks. But for instance, it was much more difficult to find robust data around CVS support offered across London, CVS support take up, and a number of other areas. In terms of what relationships and social capital looks like as a particular theme across London, so the index in its report, you'll be able to sort of look at all the maps individually on the spread of the themes, as well as how they work together across London and where is stronger and not so strong. So in terms of patterns that are sort of emerging, we sort of found that on this particular theme, it's sort of weaker in the northern fringes of London compared to the rest of the city, but there's also an inconsistent theme emerging with sort of patchworks of areas where relationships and social capital is a lot stronger and where it's sort of not. In terms of sort of democratic engagement, which is the second theme, this was broken down into 3 domains and a number of indicators that are set underneath this to measure them. And again, the boxes that are sort of shaded in red are where we found readily available and consistent data, and the ones in grey is where we're sort of not as able to find that as robust data as we would have liked. So for instance, across institutional trust, very easy to sort of find data on the proportion of people on the electoral roll, but in terms of understanding satisfaction with information from local government, perception of access, that kind of thing, is much more difficult to find sort of consistent data on those sorts of areas. And then in terms of what democratic engagement as a theme of civic strength looks like across London, in terms of patterns, it appears to be sort of broadly mixed across the capital, but you can see certain sort of clusters where engagement is really high or low across, and sorry to say, this is like actually on a ward level, so across several wards. So you can see that sort of Harrow, which is where I'm originally from, is some areas in Harrow are quite high, scoring quite high in democratic engagement, among other areas in sort of Kensington, Chelsea, Southwark and Merton. And then the last theme of civic strength, which was the easiest to measure, as you can see with all the boxes sort of shaded out in green, apart from one, there are 4 domains that sit underneath this, which is public services, financial resources, community spaces and safety. And this one was sort of by far, no surprise, was by far the sort of easiest to measure, because this is sort of information that's very readily available and recorded quite consistently across London. So in terms of public services, we're able to sort of find number of libraries, NHS funding per person, education learning opportunities, data on that quite easily. But the one we did struggle with was under the community spaces domain, around the use of community spaces and across London, how frequently these are used and engaged with. And in terms of what public and social infrastructure looks like across London, it appears to be sort of stronger in the centre of London compared to the outer boroughs, which again perhaps is not no surprise to everyone on call. But there are particular sort of clusters, as you can see, in northeast London. If you can see, my map skills are not that great, but sort of clusters that are across London. So it's really interesting to sort of look through at these maps to perhaps challenge your assumptions, and the sort of interactive task we're going to take you through later. We're really interested in seeing where perhaps people would think something would be the case when perhaps maybe they think something would perhaps score higher on civic strength, and maybe it's coming up a bit weaker, and vice versa, which hopefully you guys will sort of be able to do when you do the postcode lookup exercise later. But I'll pass back to Hannah now.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, and just to follow on from what Ludden was saying, I think we're really aware, before I talk to you about how you can use the index, I'm sure you're all looking at that and seeing kind of different shaded areas which maybe don't ring true to what you know of kind of your local spaces and where you work or where you live. And I think that's something that has generated lots of discussion in previous presentations and conversations we've had. We just want to, you know, caveat all of this with that we know that currently the data that underpins the index is quite limited, but actually we really want to. I can already see people suggesting data sets and things that we could be looking at and could be pulling into the index. So that's kind of what we want to have the conversation with you about today, and why we want people to engage with it. If it doesn't ring true, that's probably, and the data does exist, please let us know, because that is, as Ludden said, the work that we'll be doing in the next year is trying to really build out and make this index more robust. So I suppose what we wanted to just sort of talk about now was how we think people could use the index, organizations like yourself, like thinking about what like new lens this can bring for local authorities and community organizations to really understand sort of the strengths of their communities. I think the great kind of asset that this index brings is that it is kind of, you know, it brings together a lot of varied data sets which are trying to measure things which previously have been quite difficult to measure. And although we're not quite there yet, I think it kind of sets us in the right direction to be able to start putting value and measuring, you know, the stuff that we know communities do really well all the time. And then on the flip side, I think what we're really keen to sort of have the index used for is actually identifying where are there elements of civic strength that perhaps a place could be doing better at or could learn from others from, and actually explore what's going on, you know, somewhere that's really doing well in kind of democratic engagement. How can other places learn from them? And I think that's something we really want the index to be used for. I think the third thing, and I'll show you an example of how someone in one of our wider policy teams here has used the index to date, is actually looking at how levels of civic strength interact with other key indicators which are set out in existing data sets. So for example, the index of multiple deprivation, for example, or the living costs and food survey. I think on the next slide, I might be wrong, Ludden, would you be able to I've just set out how someone in our environment team has used the index to date. So they really wanted to understand how civic strength mapped across the projects that they were going to be funding through one of their new rounds of funding called the Grow Back Greener Fund. And when they looked at the index, they found on average that where funding was being directed, that the areas were scoring in the top quintile for civic strength. So although there was cover across all of them, a lot of their projects were in areas of civic strength, which I suppose might not be surprising. You know, if there's community action, community-led projects which are getting funding, that suggests that actually there might be quite a lot of democratic engagement going on in a place. They target projects to go to areas in kind of areas with kind of the two top quintiles for the IMD. So they really want to support projects in areas of deprivation, and that's what they were doing. But what it showed alongside the index is that in its current form, the index potentially highlights that they're generally funding projects that are in more deprived areas but have higher civic strength, which is really interesting to understand. You know, poverty profile, IMD doesn't necessarily, you know, often communities there have stronger levels of civic strength based on our current measure of that. What our colleague in the environment team said he would like to do next is then to do some analysis to identify locations which are low on the IMD but also score low on the civic strength index, to really identify where they could target funding in the future. So actually they could start targeting funding in areas perhaps where civic strength isn't as strong, and they could start doing some targeted comms and work there. So I just thought that was a good demonstration of how this has been used against another data set. I think I'd put another case study in, but I might skip that, Ludden, and just jump to the next. Oh, we're on to the postcode lookup. Okay, we will stop there and take any questions, I think, and then we'll go on to the sort of postcode lookup tool and give you some time to explore the index for a bit. But yeah, if there's any questions, we're happy to take them before we bombard you with more information.
that was really great, Layden and Hannah, and a really great overview. And looking forward to getting into the lookup tool. There was a kind of a few questions here, so I'm going to start off with one, which is: did you also review funding cold spots and kind of correlate that with your findings, or might that be something you do in the future?
Yeah, so there is funding data that has gone into the index. It's both in the financial services part of the public and social infrastructure theme, and it's also built into the relationships and social capital, looking at kind of local crowdfunding campaigns and where they might be within boroughs. Something we haven't built in, but something actually, a case study I haven't shared. We did an evidence review recently to identify some areas to target a funding programme, and we used the Civic Strength Index alongside some other analysis of where London Community Response Funds had gone to really identify, civic strength fee, where funding was going. So it's something we've done, but it's not it doesn't currently sit within the index as explicitly as that. So yeah, I think it's something we want to explore in this next year.
That's great. And how about social justice? I mean, I guess that's quite a broad theme in and of itself. But do you have you got data that links into that from civic strength perspective?
Social justice. I wonder, Ladden, I don't know what your thoughts from that, whether like one of the indicators is kind of capturing. So I suppose social justice is such a broad terminology. I wonder if the person asking the question, what specifically they meant by that. Ladden, come in.
Yeah, I was going to say it might be to get a fuller description of that question, but also in terms of I guess when I think of personally of social justice, I think of sort of like the avenues and routes to it. And I guess in terms of some of the democratic engagement indicators that we looked at in terms of civic participation, civic activism, things like voting, which might not be, traditional route social activism, but I guess it'd be interesting to see if there were alternative avenues to social justice that you thought perhaps might be something that might be good to see, to measure, because I guess we were looking in terms of the traditional aspect of civic activism in terms of, voting, but then also how civic activism takes its place in community life around, spaces, mutual aid groups, all that kind of thing. But yeah, if there was more detail on the question, really, keen to hear anything further we could sort of measure.
So I think it was around inequity and racism as well, experiences of racism. Yeah,
so that's not something we've currently got built into the index, but it is definitely something. So when we first sort of went out to tender for this index, one of the things that we had asked for was not only kind of a breakdown of civic strength by place, but also a breakdown of civic strength by community of interest, so by kind of those different protected characteristic groups. Obviously that's really, really hard to do. I think that's like kind of almost a step too far, and something that we would explore doing in the future. But definitely if there's kind of data sets which exist that actually demonstrate some of that stuff. I think, for example, there's the trust and social cohesion in domain within the index, which I think that kind of data could sit really well under. As Ludden mentioned, there's a number of other things. So within the democratic engagement indicator, I think we'd be really keen to explore, like we've got a domain around accessible engagement, but obviously that accessibility to engagement means lots of different things to different types of people, and I think it would be really interesting to explore what kind of data we could pull into that kind of responds to like inequity and that. So yeah, would be really interested to explore what other things you think we should be pulling into it, for sure.
I'd also just add, it's not as sort of like a complete picture, but because the civic strength index is measured on a ward level, I guess if there were particular areas of London where there were particular communities that existed on a ward level, it's not exactly a perfect capture of it right now, but that's something that could be explored, is sort of looking at scores across a ward level in particular areas where, you know, communities of interest that you wanted to see where civic strength was scoring. That might be kind of a draft proxy for the moment while we kind of look into what we can do in year 2.
That sounds good. There's a few other questions here which maybe actually we can kind of pick up in the breakout room. So I'm thinking there's one here about what data isn't available that you might have included if it was, and there might be actually, when we go into the breakout rooms, data that organisations have got on areas of civic strength, which actually would be helpful for you at the GLA to kind of know about. So, but I don't know if there was any like particular data that you're like, this is really important, but it's just like not measured.
I think there's a number of things that, like, you know, even like what I think we would assume is quite basic stuff. So, like, you know, which I'm sure you all know within your local areas, like, you know, the number of community groups or which would then help us like make the opportunities for social life indicator that much more robust. Like the data that currently underpins that is quite patchy, isn't necessarily like as inclusive we want it to be, but it's that kind of stuff which we think we know probably exists in some form in boroughs or in CVSs, but it's like, how do we unlock that to make sure that there are robust measures? So I think there's some easier stuff, and then there's like the bigger things which are quite hard to measure. So things like relationships, like how do you measure whether relationships exist within a local place and whether they're robust and whether they're effective? Like I think, and that's the kind of stuff that we want to grapple with in this next year as well. And I can talk about it a bit more at the end, but like one of our next steps is launching an innovation challenge where we're going to invite people to really explore ways of measuring these more kind of tricky indicators to measure and unpick those. So yeah, I think it would be really great to hear from you guys in the breakout rooms, like what data might exist when you've looked at this and been like, oh, of course we can measure that, we do it already. Like we really want to hear that, because it's then something we can test pulling into the index and seeing what it does, and whether we can then like support other boroughs to perhaps collect data like that or whatever. That's kind of the work we want to do next, but we really want to be guided by people like you. So yeah, thanks, Noel.
Should we look, maybe we can pick up some of the other questions in the breakout room. Should we come back to you for your postcode lookup tool?
Yes, thank you so much. So I'll just show you guys what it looks like. So this is the postcode lookup. So the index is also an interactive tool, so you can sort of type in your postcode, your place of work, or any random postcode you're sort of interested in, and get a score for the overall score for civic strength, but also across the 3 themes and across the domains that sit under the theme. And I guess sort of as a caveat before using it, we didn't want to intend to create this as a ranking of civic strength across London. So you won't be able to, unless you went in and typed in every ward and created a spreadsheet, you wouldn't be able to create sort of a, you know, my ward sits here versus this ward. It's really trying to draw out that even if a ward has a low score for civic strength, it's likely they'll be scoring high across one of the themes or one of the domains under the themes. And like Hannah said earlier, it's really to sort of understand where is scoring high and what can we learn from it, and where is scoring low and what is causing that. So we're going to sort of share the postcode lookup in the chat. It's on the, I'm going to share a link to the Young Foundation's website where the report is hosted, but within that page is embedded a link to the postcode lookup, which will download a spreadsheet. And I'm hoping for sort of 5-10 minutes we can search up some postcodes and see, yeah, and we can feedback what we thought before we head up into the breakout rooms, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Great.
I'll stop sharing for the moment and post the link in the chat, and hopefully we can reconvene in 5-10 minutes, and we'll be on hand to answer any issues, questions you have of accessing, but it will come up as a spreadsheet to use.
Cool, that sounds good. So yeah, let's reconvene at like 22 and let's have a go. I mean, I don't know whether to use my home postcode or my work postcode. I might try both.
Use them all.
Don't think the postcode lookup is appearing in the chat.
Sorry, Noel, did you have a question?
Oh, I don't. The postcodes. The postcode lookup is that in the website.
Yeah, it's on the sorry, it's on, because it's an Excel document that you have to download. It's on the website, but so when you go onto the website page, you'll then see on like the second line there's a link, and you'll be able to click on it and it will open up for you.
Good stuff. Thanks.
Sorry, Noel, are we supposed to be going to breakout rooms now?
So between now and 22, we're just going to use the postcode lookup and try it out, and then we'll go into breakout rooms after that.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
So I just looked up my home postcode, and low on financial resources, but very high on community action. I thought that was just my street's WhatsApp group, but clearly it's representative across the board.
That's good. That's
Not
good
that you use WhatsApp data.
No, yeah, I wonder. I'll double check what the data is that sits under the community action indicator. Let you know what grassroots activity, number of local crowdfunding campaigns, informal volunteering. This actually, the thing I'm looking at doesn't give me the details of those data sets, but they're the kind of headlines. I'm sure I can find it in here.
Hannah, the crowdfunding campaigns, what category would that sit under?
So that currently sits under, and this is actually another thing. If you disagree, let us know, because we can explore whether it's sitting in the right place. But at the moment, it's sitting under community action, so in the relationships and social capital theme, and it sits in community action at the moment. Yeah.
Thank you.
No worries. Because yeah, this is something as well. Like as we said, this is the first iteration, second year. Actually, maybe I should have said this before we went often to do the postcode lookup tools, and actually not everyone's back. I'll wait. I'll wait before I start speaking. Yeah, so no, I've just looked. Community action, a lot of the data from the community life survey, so collective action and informal volunteering. And then we've got 360 giving data and below the radar data, which was looking at kind of organizations like unconstituted, unregistered sort of community organizations, which is what the below the radar data pulled out. So that's what's currently giving you that measure for community action. But obviously we know there could be other things. I think someone's put their hand up. Taylor, do you have a question?
Yeah, hi. It's Jean Taylor. I'm the head of
Oh,
policy and strategy at Haringey Council.
oh, hi.
So sorry, I hope you don't mind me kind of jumping in the break. While everybody's kind of having a play with the index,
No
but
worries.
I may
Yeah.
need to head off to get something done. But I suppose I'm just really kind of interested in the way understand the kind of the focus on kind of formal civic participation, and I recognize that's really important. But I suppose, and this goes to, I think, a kind of a couple of comments in the chat, particularly, I think kind of there's somebody, Julia Owen made a few kind of comments to this effect. I wonder if there's something about recognizing that different kind of communities with different levels of resource and kind of different possibly kind of related abilities to kind of move beyond kind of meeting basic needs in their everyday life and kind of communities may have more or less kind of capacity, sort of latent kind of capacity, whether that's about time, money, bandwidth, to engage in what we would recognize as being kind of formal civic participation. But that's not to say that these are not kind of communities that are kind of coherent and support each
Yeah.
other, but maybe in more private ways that don't show up in some of the more formal organization that we would recognize through this.
Yeah.
And that's important from a kind of equality and diversity point of view, but it's also important if we feel that some of this stuff is really worth doing.
Yeah.
And it's kind of, and it's important, but we, from an equity point of view, need to think about how we support those communities to participate in this.
Yeah,
this rate.
100%. Yeah, we completely recognise that, and that's why, for example, like we're really keen to. Well, it's like how do we capture that information? Like it's so hard to, like you said, that like in a private way, in a kind of something that people might not even recognise as volunteering or informal volunteering. It's just kind of the work that they do in the life, and we know that that is actually probably always going to be a limitation of the Civic Strength Index. Like as much as we can, for example, we've got like the number of mutual aid groups which were registered when the pandemic began. You know, who's to say that lots more don't exist? They just didn't register themselves on a centralized database. And yeah, I completely recognize that. And I think that's something we're hoping, like through the innovation challenge, where we're going to invite people to think through different ways, more creative ways of capturing this data. It's going to be those kind of difficult to measure indicators that we're really going to want them to focus on, because we know that we want to capture the picture, which includes all those people that you've just mentioned who do all that, you know, fundamental work. And so, for example, the under the radar information is about those. It was done a while ago, but it was about trying to capture those groups that actually don't exist on like the Charity Commission website. But it was a piece in time, you know, that it was a bit of research done and there was funding for it. And it's like, how do we capture that data consistently? I don't know whether we ever will be able to, but I think it's worth acknowledging it. So yeah, thank you for raising that.
Yeah, and I suppose just that's really, really helpful. And just to say, I mean, obviously, I think in the context of the relationship between kind of acquisition of funding and kind of, you know, for this kind of the importance of a kind of formal profile to kind of civic, civic organization, that's really important. And for us, I mean, in Haringey, that would be a kind of critical issue, because we know that a lot of our residents will just be kind of focused on kind of meeting basic needs, and that there maybe isn't the kind of the capacity to do stuff that is kind of more. That will be kind of recognised by this index, but that's not to say that there isn't kind of latent, skill, willingness, capability. But yeah, we'd love a follow-up conversation.
Please do. I think Noel, if you share our email addresses after with the group, more than happy to have a call with you.
Definitely. There's a question from Michelle, and then after that, let's go into the breakouts.
Cool.
Michelle.
Yeah, two points really. I mean, I completely agree with Jean. I think, if you look at what is available around social capital, a lot of BAME communities, for example, they engage in volunteering in different ways to other communities. So, potentially ways, which are around, their sort of faith communities or interfamily, volunteering, etc., which wouldn't necessarily be captured by this tool. So I think that's quite important. I think there's also some issues around crowdfunding. There's certain communities who have such a low level of financial resource that they aren't able to participate in crowdfunding campaigns because they literally don't have the they don't have the financial capital, they're below that sort of threshold. So I think we do need to think about those things, but that's not to say that the index, I think, is a fantastic way of trying to capture some of those more intangible sort of aspects. The other question I wanted to ask really is about how the index interacts with other types of research, because I think some of these questions and gaps that you're talking about, I think in a sense, they're not going to be captured by data sets, they're going to be captured by qualitative research or ethnographic research. And again, with ethnographic research, it's difficult to generalize that sort of stuff. It's very rich, very deep, and it gives you those really key insights, but it's not necessarily amenable to, plugging into an index. So I suppose it's just trying to think about how you could use this practically in conjunction with other methodologies that will give you the sort of depth as well as the breadth, and I think that's really interesting. I think the other thing is just being clear about how the index can help us almost like focus our policy interventions. So again, in terms of social capital, you'll know there's two different types of social capital, bonding and bridging capital, and certainly the research that's been done has suggested that the bridging capital is the capital that allows particularly disenfranchised communities to make that sort of leap, or make that interaction with other communities where they can sort of which will maybe help them to develop. And so again, I think there does need to be some thinking about what the theory of change is, in terms of if we want to use this index to help inform our interventions, we also need to do a sort of theory of change, because just plugging in information to sort of get a number on an index is one thing, and I think that is still doing a good job. But I think there's also the nuances around what is it, what are the policy interventions that are going to actually help to have the greatest impact, and some of that is around understanding different types of capital and what you need to do to move, for example, bonded social capital into bridging capital. What are the things that allow people to make those leaps which enable them to develop, to get more financial security, and etc. And it's not necessarily just plugging in an index. Sometimes it's actually about developing relationships with, it could be just one significant other, like for example, often it's a youth worker for young people that allows them to develop their network of relationships. So I think there's some stuff that needs to be done a bit more at a granular level about how are people, what's the network of relationships that people have that allows them to, to be able to access some of these, access, equality in a sense, in all its dimensions. Sorry, that was a bit long-winded, but really exciting. This is really exciting and a really fantastic development.
No, that was really useful. And Hannah just put in the chat, like, we completely agree. The Civic Strength Index, we're not trying to just give everybody a score and you take that away and say yay or oh gosh, we're not great. It's really about bringing that to life. And like Hannah said, there are a couple of case studies in the report we'd be really keen to get your thoughts on. And also, we're trying to build some more. So if there are areas in London that you think demonstrate civic strength or a theme of civic strength in a really great way, we'd love to know how we can capture that. And because, the tool is really about what's going well and how can we replicate it? Is it even replicable across London? And I just got back to the point from Jean and also Michelle in terms of capturing those things that perhaps, from a equalities perspective, we'd be really keen to understand if there are sort of other indicators, obviously, that need to be put into the index, but also some of the things we weren't really able to capture very well was the point around sort of faith communities, spiritual communities, that offline informal volunteering, that things that aren't recorded, perhaps that are sort of more traditionally a way in which BAME communities or other communities express civic strength kind of thing. So that's something we're really keen to sort of access data or find ways to build data out on. But Hannah, I don't know if you wanted to come in on anything.
No, I don't know whether we should go to breakouts for a quick discussion. Noel, what do you think?
Yeah, maybe that I think that would be a good idea, and it also gives people a chance to share kind of what people are doing. So there's a couple of questions, some of which we started kind of touching on. So, what evidence and data do you collect in your organisations that could feed into the strengths civic strengths index kind of in the future. And again, we started this conversation, how can we think innovatively about how and what to measure and use on civic strengths. And I've created a kind of a Jamboard so that in your conversations you can kind of capture, and that way Hannah and Leyden can then kind of have a look at that kind of after the session. So I'm going to kind of create some breakout rooms now, and because we've only got kind of 10 minutes left, I suggest we don't come back into the main room, but do kind of jot your ideas in the Jamboard as you're discussing, and an opportunity for you to kind of connect with other people. But I want to kind of thank Hannah and Leyden before we go into the breakout rooms for a really great presentation, and for taking all those different questions. I don't know, Hannah, if you wanted to mention anything before we go.
Just to say, no, I know there's loads of questions that have been put in the chat that we've not got to, but if there's any way of kind of sharing them with us, Leyden and I are more than happy to kind of like respond to them, and we'll share them back with you now, and you can circulate them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, we'll share
but
that.
Yeah, thank you so much. And if anyone wants to also reach out and have an additional conversation, follow up with us and our team, like, please feel free to. We really want to work with you guys on this and think through how we can make the index a more useful tool and a more robust evidence base. So yeah, please do reach out. Thank you.
Cool. Right, let's go into our breakout rooms.
Locus of control. Yeah.